And thank you all for inviting us and participating today as well. So as Lee mentioned, today we're going to be talking about Photovoice, and we hope that by the end of this session, you'll be able to describe what Photovoice is and when you would use it, discuss the steps in the process of completing a Photovoice project, including some best practices that we'll share with you from some of our experiences, and then also describe some of the strengths and limitations of the methodology. So to briefly start, we were wondering if you could share a little bit about what you've heard about Photovoice, and if you're here because you've never heard of Photovoice before and would like to just learn about it, what do you think it entails based off of the name? You can either put it in the chat or unmute yourself.
I have heard of Photovoice. I haven't had the opportunity to put it into practice, but I think it's something that stands out to me about Photovoice is it's very participant-led and focused on engaging participants in collecting the data themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So kind of the critical purpose of Photovoice is to be participatory and to give voice to participants through photography. Awesome. All right. So I wanted to give a little bit of background on Photovoice. So the Photovoice process was first used by Caroline Wang and Marianne Burris in the mid-1990s. They used Photovoice to conduct a needs assessment of the Women's Reproductive Health and Development Program in 2 counties of Yunnan province in China. So the idea of the approach was that women would take photographs of their homes, their villages, where they're working, and that they would use those photos to document health issues related to the program and of greatest concern to them, and use those to communicate those issues to the program planners and policymakers. So in the original paper, which is shown here, the method was first referred to as a photo novella. Wang and Burris later changed that name to Photovoice a couple of years later to better reflect a process that isn't just about storytelling through photos, but also to reflect a process that could be used as a tool for empowerment or mobilizing social change. And that really speaks to the underlying principles of Photovoice. And there are 3 that are typically discussed. The first draws from Paulo Freire's teachings that education takes place in the context of people's lives. And that suggests that members of a community then can identify and critically assess problems in their own communities, and that they can work together and dialogue to enact change. The Photovoice approach also draws on feminist theories and methods which center women as actors in the world. So the original project was intended to ground the findings in women's experiences. So it wasn't that the work was on women, but it was by women and with women as part of the process. So it gave the women who were involved the power to tell their stories and to affect change. So the Photovoice project has been used with a number of marginalized communities since the 90s. So if you do a Google Scholar search of Photovoice, you'll see a number of different topics that are covered. And that leads to the final kind of theoretical underpinning, which relates to documentary photography. So in the original paper, Wang and Burris highlight concerns about documentary photography in terms of who really stands to benefit from those photographs. So the original paper shows the migrant mother photograph of Florence Thompson, who's shown here. This is one of the world's most reproduced photographs. However, 40 years after this photograph was taken, Ms. Thompson was interviewed and she describes feeling exploited. So in this article from the 70s, she says, "That's my picture hanging all over the world and I can't get a penny out of it. What good's it doing me?" So the Photovoice process is intended to disrupt that, to provide an opportunity for someone who might be a subject of a photograph like Ms. Thompson to take photos that describe themselves in the way that they want to be portrayed, and to use those photographs in ways that they want them to be used. And if there are any questions, feel free to stop me as well, or Katie. So that in some ways links to a question about the difference between Photovoice and photo elicitation techniques. Both use photographs as a way to gather and share information about a population, and at least from my experiences, photos are a really great way to elicit discussion. However, photo elicitation doesn't necessarily have an explicit focus on enacting change. It's often a discussion between a participant and a researcher. Sometimes the photos can be taken by participants, sometimes the researcher brings them, but there isn't this shared community discussion around the topic with an intention to mobilize the community. Whereas Photovoice is a community-based participatory research method, which I know QuIRI talked about previously, that has an explicit intention of working with communities to capture their perspectives and to identify issues within the community. So to give a voice to the community, so to speak. So since Wang and her colleagues first described the method, it's been used around the world. Katie and I will walk you through some projects that we have done with mothers in Haiti in the post-2010 earthquake context related to breastfeeding, with sedentarized and nomadic pastoralists in Kenya related to their changing environments, and then with fishing and rice growing communities in Cambodia related to their livelihoods. So Photovoice will typically follow a similar process. The first is training participants. So you give them a training, they then go into the field and take their photographs and come back to be interviewed. Then they participate in a focus group discussion, which sometimes leads back to going back into the community, taking photographs and rediscussing them again. And eventually leads to outcomes such as individual empowerment, enhanced understanding of community needs and assets, and action or advocacy to affect policy change. So we'll walk you through some of these, and we'll start with the training, which has 3 parts typically related to conceptual, ethical, and technical dimensions. So the conceptual training is intended to introduce the project to participants. What is Photovoice? Why are you doing this? And so participants know why they're there. In Haiti, we used a hand model to highlight the things that a mother might consider, because it doesn't necessarily have to be, we were looking at breastfeeding, it didn't necessarily need to be a literal photo of breastfeeding. And so we wanted mothers to understand it could be a lot of different things, and Katie will talk a little bit about symbolism. But we used the hand model to kind of remind mothers of the range of different topics they might cover. So the thumb was like things that were good, going well, that they felt strongly about. The pinky were things that were challenges or weaknesses, because like you can't hold a bag with your pinky. The pointer was like you're pointing or showing something related to infant feeding. The ring finger was family, and the middle finger were things that they found pride in. So like no matter what other people said about them, they were gonna do it. Anyway. It worked really well, and so I recommend having something like that if you were to do a Photovoice project, so people can just remember, oh, these are the sorts of things I might cover. In addition to understanding what the project is about, which ideally they're part of developing in some capacity, it also has, it's also an opportunity, this conceptual training, to include participants as active members to the process, so that they're part of the decision-making about what sorts of things that they might be taking photographs of, so that they can teach the community about the goals of the project and feel like they have some ownership of that, and even to solicit community's feedback in that process.
Okay, so I'm gonna pick it up for a little bit, and we'll jump back and forth a little bit throughout this presentation. So ethics is also a really big part of the training. And just as photographs are really valuable because they provide a lot of insight into a situation, they can also be really dangerous if they're not used for a good purpose. And so as such, when you're working with marginalized populations, it can be especially important to make sure that participants know when to engage in self-censorship. And they need to know what actions or things would be relevant to photographs versus not, and to determine what's in the best interest of themselves, their families, and their communities. So it's important to talk about what those harms might be with the group that's taking photos, It's not only physical harms, but also emotional harm, harm to reputation, finances, etc. And so this brings us back to the point of Photovoice being community-based, and participants really understanding their role as active participants in the work. And so an example of this, so in Cambodia, we worked with fishers who are taking pictures of their livelihoods, you know, on the like potential harm to you, but maybe in some limited way, you might not want to show people your best fishing grounds, right? So you might want to be strategic in some ways about the photographs you're taking there. And on a more extreme side, you know, a lot of fishers that we worked with were also more concerned about the authorities and whether they would perceive the things that they're doing as illegal. You know, there is some fuzziness about who's fishing in illegal ways and what that looks like. And that can be a real harm to participants if there's a risk of photographs of individuals getting out in that way. And so the best practice when it comes to people is just not to take pictures that take photographs of people's individual likenesses. And so one way to do that is to keep people out of the photograph entirely, taking pictures of things like infrastructure, as you see here, or animals, other objects. And then when people are a really important part of a community, as they always are, often what people want to take photographs of is people. And so another way to deal with this is to really work with participants to think about ways that they can include people in their photographs that don't reveal who they are. And so at the end of the day, it's not necessarily up to the researcher if people really want to take photographs of people. So helping them to think about ways to do it. So not including someone's face in a photograph, taking pictures of a hand, taking pictures from behind, or in other ways can be really important things that you teach participants about how they can take photographs that don't include identifiable features. And so in the cases where people are identifiable, you can certainly talk with participants about that throughout the process, and ultimately blurring or blocking out faces, you know, and for research use cases is a common way that people deal with this too. You know, maybe someone feels that a picture that includes a person is really important, but then you can modify it as it's being used for a research purpose so that you're not maybe sharing that picture further. And related to this is also that it's really important to train participants to ask permission before taking photographs, asking themselves those questions and explaining the project and obtaining consent when needed. And so I think, you know, more and more phones and cameras are everywhere, and this isn't something that's foreign to people, the idea that that people might not want to be in a photograph. And so I think really just emphasizing when consent is needed and when consent might not be needed is an important part of this training. And then another big part of the training is on the technical aspects. So this first training includes technical training on how to use a camera. So these are basic things like how to hold it, how to keep your finger out of the viewfinder, how to use the flash, about lighting, how to protect a camera from heat or water from being dropped. A tip is that Ithaca Reuse is a tremendous source for camera cases. I feel like they have so many there and they sell them for $1. But really just familiarizing participants with the camera itself. And so from our experience, people are generally pretty familiar with how to use cameras, especially with phones being more accessible. It's worth noting that sometimes the instructions on the camera itself might be in English, and that might not be people's native language. And so, you want people, if a wheel turns, to have the familiarity to be able to fix it. And also ideally to sort of have a phone number they can call for support that's printed on the camera, so that you've tagged on. And so we've done Photovoice projects with digital cameras and disposable cameras. I personally have only used digital ones. They both can work, but we want to highly recommend digital for a bunch of reasons. So participants can take a lot more photos and delete them easily if they don't want those photos. It's easier and in many cases cheaper to print them, especially if you have a printer handy. And it also helps facilitate the timing of interviews because the photos can initially be discussed and selected, as we'll show in the next couple of slides, just using the viewfinder itself. So a strong endorsement of the digital option. And finally, the last part of the training that we wanted to discuss is composition. And so training in this sense is really about helping people to just think through what makes photos powerful and how to create those powerful photos. So they have the tools to think about this as they're going through. And so I think the hand model that Elizabeth shared earlier is part of that structure, but a handful of little tips can be really helpful too. And so this includes things like keeping the light to the photographer's back to make sure the subject's illuminated, taking candid photographs as opposed to posed ones, playing with perspective. And so this image of a camel up close and personal, it's really different than if you just took a picture of its body, right? Considering symbolism of photographs. So it doesn't necessarily have to be the image itself is super exciting, but it might say something really important. And the rule of thirds and balances within a photograph and how to structure it. You know, if you take a photo of a tree head on, it can be less powerful than if you offset it, kind of thing, and helping people just to think about how they structure the composition. And so this is an aspect also that people generally find to be really fun. You can present some of the concepts and make the process as participatory as possible for people to then go and practice in the trainings too. And so once your participants have been trained, they go out into their communities to take photographs. And so this is the next like big part of this step. And so they typically take photos for, you know, somewhere in the neighborhood of 1 to 2 weeks. But there have been successful projects that have also used a few days as a window as well. I think really thinking about, you know, what participants have been charged to do and what's reasonable for sort of how often they might encounter this thing or what might happen is important. So if you want people to think about something that happens only a couple times a week, obviously you give them more time. And so participants come back and then they do an individual interview. So this looks like selecting 2 to 5 photographs that they believe are important to share with the community. And for each picture, you go through an interview guide using this showed technique. And so the showed technique is a question strategy that's intended to help participants move from discussing their personal experiences to more of a social and action-oriented level. So it starts with questions about what do you see happening here, moves to what is really happening, what's sort of behind the scene that might not be in the image itself. How does this relate to your life or our lives? Why does this situation or strength exist? And what can we do about it to really move to the action plan piece? And it also includes titling or captioning the photograph to really encapsulate it as well. And so we wanted to give you all an opportunity to think about how this process works. And so you obviously didn't have a chance to go out and take pictures over days or weeks in the past stretch of time, but we thought that it might be possible to find on a phone camera a picture that encapsulates the story of life during a pandemic. So we're going to send you into breakout rooms and ask you to flip through your phones for a moment, and maybe if one person can identify a picture that they think would work for this, that then the other members of the group can interview that person using the showed technique. And then a final person in the group will be an observer that reports back about how the technique worked. And so we'll copy and paste the showed questions into the chat. So you can grab them from the shared chat here so that when you're in your breakout room, you have them as well. All right, any questions about that? Okay, great. All right, so then I think we'll send you to the breakout rooms now. So go ahead and join it when it pops up. All right.
That was great.
Oh, good. It looks like we've got you all back now, which is also great. As the success of the breakout rooms. So I hope you all had a good interview and got a little more perspective on what the process looks like. And I'm curious, is there anything that surprised you about the interview?
I think the conversation to bounce back ideas using the prompts and taking the conversation in different directions than where it initially started. So and the picture helped with that.
Oh, nice. Yeah, that sounds great. I mean, I think having both the visual and the story progress can be really strong. Yeah, other thoughts?
I was really surprised, I guess, at how the questions got us to be talking about really structural kinds of issues. And, you know, even though they're very intimate photos, it really led to a much broader question and discussion about structure and institutions.
Yeah, I see a lot of nodding heads. I think that is a really neat thing about it, that it sort of starts with like, okay, what's literally here? And then as soon as you ask about what's behind the photo, what doesn't the eye see, you really, it quickly sort of gets into this much bigger picture. Yeah, that's great. Any key themes that emerged for people? I'm curious if you all had the same resonance for your pandemic photos or not.
For ours, I mean, I always wanted to provide the picture. It was more so our theme was about, I guess, disruptions in transportation and things that people need to get elsewhere.
And very salient themes for this moment in time. Yeah, so how do folks think the whole process might have gone differently if you were doing a regular semi-structured interview rather than having it be based directly on issues around having shared a photograph?
It's kind of a tough question, Katie. I'm gonna let you know that right now. It's kind of tough.
Because it was so narrowed on one specific experience from the photo, and so everything was organic, I don't see how a semi-structured interview could replicate that without and having to be longer. In such a short amount of time, we kind of got really into looking at, you know, a picture, that one prompt of like what is actually happening in the picture. And then, you know, it's not just boxes. We're talking about consumerism and capitalism still thriving during the pandemic and just taking a different form. And I'm sure it would have taken much longer in an interview, but because that the questions that we had in the picture just helped the conversation flow easier.
Yeah, that's a great
I agree with
observation.
Daisy. Yeah, I have to agree with Daisy. I feel like we were able to explore more themes using the picture, things that I feel like in a semi-structured interview, as she said, would take longer, or we may not have been able to elicit at all.
I think too, there's something to be said about how the participant sharing a photo that they took can change the power dynamic in the discussion, because with a semi-structured interview, it's, you know, for the most part, the interviewer, you know, even if they're not trying to, like, they're the one who's created the questions and are kind of leading the conversation. And as much as you can hope that the participant's going to bring their experiences, it's like, I don't know, by having that photo, it, like, the participant can feel like they have more stake in the conversation. They have like something that something to build off of, that they feel confident in already because it's kind of tangible. And so I think that that in itself creates a more comfortable environment for them.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, I think that's right. Sort of starting with something that comes from the participant as opposed to comes through the interviewer does set a different tone, and lets the participant lead in a lot of ways. Well, those are all really great reflections. So thank you all, and thank you for participating in our activity. I hope it gives you a little window into what the process is like. So we're gonna pick up there, and so in the next phase of the Photovoice process, participants take the photographs that they've taken in this photo taking and interview documentation part and bring them together and look at each other's photographs and have a focus group discussion about them. And so this, again, really involves participants in the analysis of what's there. And so photos that were selected for being shared with the group, participants used to share their stories and meanings, and also then to discuss what themes emerge and issues that come up that matter most to them across the whole set of photographs. And so I'm going to share one example from the work that I did in Cambodia with 4 communities. So 2 of them were fishing and rice growing communities that were sort of a little bit further from the Tonle Sap Lake, but very much a part of a network of smaller lakes and rivers and channels and rice fields, which people also fish in, as well as 2 communities that were right next to the Tonle Sap Lake and really predominantly fishing. And so we invited both men and women in households to participate. We wanted to give both people cameras and let them share their own perspective. And in most households that worked out, though, we wound up with a few more men than women in the aggregate. And so I'm going to just give you a little bit of a picture of some of the photographs that we had our participants sharing and some of the themes that emerged from that. And so the first in the upper left is really, there was a big theme of representations of a really rich diversity of fish and other aquatic animals that people value, that they cook in all sorts of different ways, that they catch regularly, that are part of their favorite meals. And so people talked about this for sure in the interviews and the focus groups. But this also was actually like a particularly visual piece, because I'm showing you one photograph here, but everyone's photos had different fish in them. So there's like a true visual diversity. So the participant that took this photograph said, I can see many kinds of fish I can use to support my family. And then in the upper right, I think building from that, we also really heard from people that catch determines meals and income. And there's a real juxtaposition of what the environment provides and the challenges that people face in maintaining that. And so the participant that was sharing this photograph said, during the dry season, it's hard to catch fish. My husband catches more fish in the wet season, and there's a wider variety of fish and more fish. I eat more meals during the wet season. So really highlighting the seasonal difference and sort of the environmental drivers here. And then in the bottom left, this was really, we also had a lot of photographs where people took the photograph and then talked about the challenges that they were facing as fishers. And so here, this photograph is really beautiful. This is the person's child sorting some of the fish. But what the participant said about it was that when I look at this photograph, we caught only a small quantity of fish. I'm upset when I think about making a living from this. The fish that I caught don't even fill up the container. It only filled up the bottom of the container. And so I think this is kind of a neat example of the real disparity between what you might outwardly see in a photograph and what it really represents to the person who took it. And then we also had a lot of people sharing what it looks like for them out in the environment and fishing. And so this also led to a lot of additional requests for support in enforcing regulations, for changing regulations to allow different methods, for reducing conflict with authorities and increasing stocking and fish availability. And so in this bottom right photograph, the participant said, I want conservation for fishing from the government because this year fish population is less than other past years. And so kind of highlighting kind of just some of the themes that emerged from this set of photographs that people shared, both the themes and the pictures that came with them. And so I'll pass back to Elizabeth to share an example from the next stage of the process in her work.
Yeah, so the focus group discussion, as I alluded to earlier, can also be an iterative process. I don't have specific examples of that from my own work, but I did want to just highlight that that's something that happens. If you're interested in these like longer term examples of Photovoice, I would recommend looking at Manuel Franco's team in Spain. They have a number of examples of this where participants take photographs and then a few months later come have their discussion, a few months later come back with additional photographs to really advance ideas to get more in depth over time. And I'm happy to share those if you guys reach out as examples. So ultimately, these discussions are intended to highlight issues that are important to the community, particularly in terms of determining the key factors that participants believe need to be changed. And these outcomes can happen at an individual level. This is a quote from one of the mothers in Haiti who talked about how talking with the group made her feel like she had a space to talk about the issues she was facing and challenges she was facing with breastfeeding. And to hear about the shared experience was really important for her versus just sitting at home alone, experiencing it on her own. Outcomes also happen at the community level, both in terms of raising awareness, but also in terms of advocating for change. So in the Haiti project, which I should have noted earlier was part of an existing program to support infant feeding, one of the more experienced health workers in the program said that she knew that the situation of mothers was not great, but she didn't realize how isolated the mothers were and the challenges that they were really facing. So this illuminated to her and gave her a little bit more awareness of the population she was working with. And as a result, during the monthly education sessions with participants, that health worker started to incorporate more participatory activities to elicit those experiences and to provide a space for those mothers to share their experience if they wanted, versus kind of a more didactic educational approach, which often was occurring before. We also integrated more psychosocial support and counseling approaches for the mothers in the program. And that really came from the mothers speaking during the focus group about needing a little bit more social support. So this is an example of kind of some of the outcomes that emerged. So in conclusion, we wanted to highlight a few lessons that we've learned through the process. First, Photovoice is a great tool to mobilize community and to facilitate discussion about issues that are important to communities from their perspective. That said, it seems like change is often more operational when you're using Photovoice, at least from our experiences at a program level. Like being able to catalyze policy shifts, it's possible like other Photovoice projects have done that, but from my experiences, it's more, it's easier to operationalize it at a program perspective. And if you think back to the original paper, that was a program assessment as well. So it's not to say it can't be done, but I think having more specific outcomes of how the Photovoice can be used that can be operationalized is really important, especially for participants to be able to see the outcomes and to be able to change things. Okay, so the second one is that the process allows participants to decide what data to use and how to interpret it. So that gives a lot of control to the participant to decide what they want to share versus not. And I know, at least from my experiences, some of the photos that the participants took were absolutely stunning, but the participants didn't pick those photos to talk about. And really, that's the point of the Photovoice approach, not to have an outsider impose what the story is or what is being shared. And so, like, I'm not using those photographs in presenting the work because the person didn't select them. So it kind of takes the power away from the researcher, which is what the Photovoice process is really about at the end of the day. From a more kind of technical analytic approach, although taking photographs can be really easy to do, they're complex to analyze. And I know you've all heard the phrase, a picture is worth 1,000 words. Well, when you're coding 1,000 words, it can be complex and people are looking at photographs and seeing different things. So not only in terms of this analytic process, it can be difficult to analyze, but also literally in the tools you have for analyses. Both Katie and I use In Vivo, and there's no way to code photographs and text together. Like if you're coding a photograph, it's like separate from the text and they're not linked. Maybe future versions of In Vivo will have that, or other analytic programs, but that's definitely a challenge to take into account. And so you need to be really organized in terms of linking what things go together. The publishing environment can also be pretty challenging, particularly if you're aiming for journals that don't have a history of publishing Photovoice projects. Though over the past few years, there have been a number of Photovoice projects that have been published. It's possible that that's changing, but at least from my experiences the last 5+ years, it can be a challenge. And then finally, we wanted to conclude that these approaches and methods are tools. So you use different methods and tools in your methodological toolkit that you are building on with your QuIRI seminars or wherever you are learning about methods. So you select your tools from your toolbox based off of what questions you have, what the purpose of your projects are. And so Photovoice is a really great tool when you're trying to mobilize communities and to find out what's important from a community's perspective. And it also complements a number of other tools. So here I have an example of participatory asset mapping, or you could even do it with social mapping, where it might complement other methods that aren't focused explicitly on getting the literal lens of a participant. So with that, we wanted to thank you for your attention and your participation. And we'll open up for any questions or comments or reflections on how you might use Photovoice in your practice, or if there's content that resonated with you. Yeah, so thank you.